My name is Warren Herold. I'm a philosopher at the University of Arkansas. One of my collaborators, as you just heard, is Walter Sowden, who's here with me. He's at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research and the University of Michigan, which I just learned. I didn't think he was still at the University of Michigan, but he's at both. And our other collaborator, Ethan Cross, is not with us, but Walt is a social psychologist, I should have said, and Ethan is also a social psychologist at the University of Michigan. So our plan today is first to give a little refresher in case there are any of you out there who don't remember every single thing that I said, like a year ago. I'll help you out and give you a few hints, reminders of what we talked about last time. Just give an overview of our study design and proposal and the questions we were trying to answer. We'll then go through some results. We do have results from one study that we've performed, and they're interesting results. So then we'll talk a bit about the interpretation and then some next steps. So there are a lot of questions remaining, so we're going to have quite a bit of work to do going forward. So we'll discuss what our plans are, and then of course open it up to Q&A. So I'll start the refresher with a quote from Adam Smith. So a lot of this work is inspired, at least, by the work of Adam Smith and some of his writings in the theory of moral sentiment. So I'll start with a passage from him. He writes that were it possible that a human creature could grow up to manhood in some solitary place without any communication with his own species, he could no more think of his own character, of the propriety or demerit of his own sentiments and conduct, of the beauty or deformity of his own mind, than of the beauty or deformity of his own face. So Smith thinks that if someone were raised and living in complete social isolation, they would do things, of course. They would do things, they would exhibit certain behavioral patterns, they would think certain thoughts, they would feel different things, but their attention would always be focused on the world around them, the external world, everything out there that they can see. They would never turn their attention inward, they would never focus on themselves. They would have thoughts and feelings, but no thoughts or feelings about their own thoughts or feelings. If you bring a person like this into society, though, every single thing about them will change. So what happens when you bring a person into society? If you surround me with other people, I immediately begin to observe your conduct. I see that you're doing certain things. I see that you're feeling certain ways. And automatically, I just immediately begin to judge, to evaluate you, to approve of some things you do, to disapprove of some things you do, to maybe blame you for things that you've done wrong, hold you accountable for your actions when I think you did the wrong thing. And very quickly after that, I realize that you're doing the exact same thing to me. And so I become curious. I start to wonder, well, do I deserve the praise when I get the praise? Do I deserve the blame when I get the blame? Have I really done right or wrong, or are the people around me all just confused? I try to figure out whether I've really acted correctly or incorrectly or whatever, whether I'm really blameworthy. So how do I do that? Well, I start to look at other people. I start to look at myself in the same way that I was previously looking at other people. I try to think about myself as if I were just some other rather than myself. Smith writes that we suppose ourselves the spectators of our own behavior and endeavor to imagine what effect it would in this light produce upon us. I'm going to call this process of imagining oneself as the spectator of one's own conduct, I'll refer to this as self-distancing. This is not what Smith called it, but this is what my collaborators and other psychologists call it nowadays. So this is a very important process, according to Smith. It enables us to develop a capacity for self-evaluation. And if you think that self-evaluation is a necessary part of having a self, then engaging in this process of self-distancing is what enables us to develop a moral self. And Smith thinks that when we do this, it changes us. We look at ourselves differently, we think differently, we feel differently. And it has two principal effects that he identifies. The first effect is that self-distancing moderates emotional reactivity and enables or enhances our capacity for self-control. Smith writes that by placing ourselves in our spectator's shoes, we come to conceive some degree of coolness about our own fortune. The process abates the violence of our feelings. Abates the violence of our feelings. And he says other things as well to illustrate this point. So that's effect one, is this moderating effect. Effect two, Smith claims that self-distancing leads us to place more weight on the rights and interests of other people, thereby enabling a proper comparison between our own interests and those of others. He thinks that self-distancing teaches us things. It teaches us that we're really not all that special, each one of us. We're all just but one of the multitude, in no respect better than any other. Teaches us the propriety of resigning the greatest interests of our own for the yet greater interests of others. And it teaches us that in most cases, when we're not engaging in this process of self-distancing, we tend to value ourselves a bit too much, and we value other people too little. So this idea, these claims about the way we develop the capacity for critical self-evaluation and the way we develop a moral self give rise to a particular conception of virtue based on these two effects that Smith points out. And he claims that virtue is just this. The man of the most perfect virtue is he who joins to the most perfect command of his own original and selfish feelings the most exquisite sensibility both to the original and sympathetic feelings of others. So the perfectly virtuous moral agent is one who thinks relatively little about herself, thinks a great deal about others, and at all times regulates her conduct from a self-distanced point of view and exhibits considerable self-control, self-command. So I think this is a really interesting view. He ties together a lot of pieces and creates a nice comprehensive picture that connects the moral self with different forms of motivation and a conception of virtue, but it all rests on two empirical claims that we need to ask questions about. So the first question we need to ask, of course, is does self-distancing actually moderate emotional reactivity and enhance self-control the way that Smith thinks it does? And the second question is, does self-distancing actually lead us to think about others in the way he suggests and to place more weight on the rights and interests of others? I'm not going to go into any detail, but I'll just say that we have a good sense of what the answer to the first question is, and the quick answer is yes. It does do these things. And that's actually what Ethan and Walter have done a lot of work on. But the second question is a little trickier to answer. Right now I'd say, well, at least at the beginning of our project, the answer was this, that we really don't know at all. And so that's the question we're trying to answer. So our goal, or at least our goal as we originally formulated it, is to test whether self-distancing does in fact lead people to place more weight on the rights and interests of others. And we're going to use a multi-method approach, relying on laboratory studies, a series of laboratory studies to isolate various mechanisms in a carefully controlled lab environment, and then move on to a field study that tries to look at these things in the real world. So I believe I'm going to turn it over to Walt then, who's going to tell you a little bit about the results that we've found so far.
Sure. Thanks, Warren. Good afternoon. So what I'm going to talk about is how self-distance works psychologically and how we've taken the ideas of Adam Smith and Warren and taken the research that we've done in the lab, looking at the effects of self-distancing on emotional reactivity and self-control, and applying this to the moral domain. So what self-distancing looks like. So this is what self-immersion looks like, just a person who is the same of their experiencing self is the same as their reasoning self, so they're one and the same. Self-distancing, on the other hand, is you have the ability to look upon yourself performing an action. So your reasoning self and your experiencing self has been separated. So you're thinking about yourself doing something or remembering yourself doing something. And so we have found in our lab, or people who have done research around self-distancing, broadly speaking, have found that self-distancing enhances performance under stress, the maintenance of short and long-term regulation, emotion regulation under stress, goal perseverance and motivation, improves in executive functioning. It's been shown to neural and physiological indices of emotion regulation, so done with using brain scanners and things like that. It shows that it even regulates neural activity. Recently, we've shown that it improves wise reasoning. And then most recently, the work that Ethan and I have done, it's shown to improve ethical decision making. So this series of studies, or this body of research, leads to the question that Adam Smith has presented us. Does it also improve virtue, or does it enhance virtues? So how do we do this? There's a couple different ways that we can initiate self-distancing in the laboratory and in the field. The one way that we're doing it with this body of research that we propose and we are continuing to execute, is using language. And so in a self-immersed condition, like most people, you refer to yourself in the first person using words like I or me. That's how most of us think about our behavior and how we operate in the world. However, a self-distance perspective would be using third-person pronouns or your own name when referring to your behavior or yourself in the world. And so we know that people typically use first-person pronouns to refer to the self, and that they also refer to the other people using non-first-person pronouns. And we've seen that using these parts of speech should lead people to think more about themselves like they would other people. With one caveat that's very important, that unlike when you're thinking about other people, you don't have full access to their mind. When you're thinking about yourself performing an action, you do have access to that person's mind, which happens to be yourself. So this adds a little bit of a difference than when you're just doing thinking about other people or perspective taking from a social perspective. So the overview of research that we proposed was a combination of laboratory studies and a field study. So the first aim was to do this in the laboratory to isolate the variable and to see how it operates in concert across different paradigms when we look at how it influences virtue. So the first study that we did, and what we'll talk about the results from this first study, is we used the Dictator Game, which was already described, and I'll go over a little bit of it here in a minute. And then to take that same idea and apply it in a different context where maybe some different values or different motives are at stake or at play, we are going to do it with the public goods game. And then finally, we developed a helping task that we're going to run where it combines elements of the first two games to see if when different emotions or different motives are at work, does self-distancing have a different effect on pro-social behavior. And then finally, we want to conduct a field study where we're going to use experiential sampling methods to see how this works in the wild and how we can longitudinally model self-distancing and pro-social behavior. So the method the Dictator Game, it's fairly well known, but I'll just describe it quickly. So there's two people that come into the lab. In our paradigm, one's a Confederate. Ostensibly, it's another participant, but it is a Confederate in our initial paradigm. The pair is given $10, and they're told that one will be assigned as the decider, and the other will be decided as the recipient. But all along, it'll always be the participant who is the decider. And this participant will decide on how they're going to divvy up this $10 between the two people who are participating in the experiment. We randomize that person into one of two groups, either a self-immersed condition or a self-distant condition, by prompting them to use different types of language, either the immersed with first-person pronouns or the distance with their own name. And then they given the several options of how they're going to divide this money up, and they make the decision. As simple as that. Doesn't take very long at all. But what it does is it models this fairness and intuition and how they are going to divvy it up. Typically, when this has been done in previous research, there is a powerful urge to overcome your selfish desires and split the money in some sort of equitable way. So our prediction here for this behavior was that people in the distancing condition would give more than they would in the immersed condition. And we did an analysis based on our previous research and other research that has been done using the Dictator Game. And we thought that there would be an effect, a moderate effect, so about Cohen's d of 0.5. So after a power analysis, we came up with an N of about 134 people that we needed to test in order to detect the effect that we thought we were going to get. So here are the results. So for the immersed condition, it looks similar to what previous research has found. We had an N of 60. You see that the mean is 5.6, a little bit over half. The money is distributed. Standard deviation matches what's typically in the literature. And you can see in the pie chart that 77% of the people split at 50-50. However, the distancing condition, we see that the effect that we predicted is the opposite. So people that were distanced actually kept more for themselves. They only split almost 60% of the time, and 38% of the time they were selfish. And so this was a little surprising, to say the least. Caused a little bit of deep integration between the psychologist and the philosopher. But we had an effect, and we were still running participants, as you can see the note here. It's only powered at 0.5 because I followed a procedure that Lakins has advised researchers to do. When you get to your a priori power and you look at the data and you see that your effect size is not the effect that you predicted, then you rerun a power analysis using a different technique, and actually we're well underpowered. So we're going to continue to run this study to see what happens, but we believe that the effect is there, just a matter of running it to a sufficient power analysis. So we're still running this study right now. And I'll go ahead and let Warren make meaning of the different results than we predicted, but I'll come back and talk about future research.
Yeah, so this is pretty surprising. I did not expect this. I was really scared, though, that we would just get no result at all, so we got something, right? That's something. Actually, so seriously, this has been extremely interesting and beneficial. And now that I know what I know, I'm quite happy that we got the opposite result, because what it forced us to do is kind of go back to the drawing board and figure out what our theory was in the first place. Because at first we were relying on this historical text. We thought we saw some claims in that text. We thought they were intuitive. They seemed about right to us. And so we thought about it a bit, but then we just kind of went forward. The surprising result has now forced us to think much more carefully about what the connection is, or what the alleged connection is or might be, between psychological distance or self-distancing and moral motivation and conduct. And that's been great. This is the real deep integration part of our project thus far, was really thinking about this and going back and forth. And I'll tell you, we don't agree with one another. Well, yeah, there's a fair bit of disagreement. It's going well. We're not killing each other, but there's disagreement within the team. So the deep integration is strong. So I want to try to offer a few different explanations about what might be going on here, what might be driving these surprising results. And as you'll see, we don't have the data in this first study to differentiate between these different hypotheses and figure out which one is right. So we need to go forward and acquire some more data. So this is what's driving some of our next studies. So here's one hypothesis. It might be that self-distancing causes individuals to regulate their behavior by whatever principle or principles of conduct they happen already to endorse. So it might just be that when our subjects come into the lab to play this game, they already endorse some principle of conduct. Maybe they just endorse the principle that says all resources should be divided equally among all people. And that's just what they think. In general, they're just egalitarians. That's their view. Other subjects who come in to play this game might endorse a different principle. They have been reading lots of Ayn Rand recently or whatever, and they just endorse the principle, do whatever's best for you, regardless of what happens to other people. It doesn't matter. So it might be that self-distancing just causes each individual to regulate their conduct by whatever principle they endorse. It might just give them more access to that principle and make it more salient. There's some reason to think this. There's a rationale here. It's not just the philosopher's intuition. We know a few things. So we know that psychological distance in general promotes abstract thought. And Eyal and Lieberman have argued that, well, moral principles tend to be abstract. So if you put these two things together, you get a pretty quick result. All else equal, if psychological distance promotes abstract thought and moral principles tend to be abstract, then you might think that psychological distance will just promote adherence to moral principle. It might just make people act in accordance with their own endorsed moral principles. Now we know that when you self-distance, you represent your own circumstances as if they're distant circumstances. You represent your own circumstances, more abstractly. So self-distancing increases psychological distance, which increases abstract thought, which may increase your access to these moral principles. Now this could potentially explain the results that we've seen so far. So as I said, if some of the subjects came in already endorsing a principle of dividing everything evenly, then we would see that subset of the sample choose to give away $5 and keep $5. And if another subset of the sample decided or endorsed the principle of just do whatever's in their own best interest, then we'd see another group keeping all of the money. And in fact, so that graph wasn't up yet. I don't know if it comes later or what.
later.
It'll come later. So you'll see a histogram that shows the distribution, and that is what we see. In the immersed group, we see lots of people just doing the 50-50 split. And then it's not like the whole distribution moves over. It's not that. It's that we see a different distribution where lots of people are still doing the 50-50 split, and then lots of people are just keeping all of the money. So this hypothesis is consistent with the data.
Can you just clarify what the manipulation was? What was it exactly? You say, John, how much should John get?
Yeah. So the individual is instructed. Well, do you want to take this to make sure I don't butcher it?
It's, the only thing that changes is the use of I or the use of Walt for me. And we try to scrub it for any type of normative language, so we don't say, what should I do or what should Walt do? It's what is Walt going to do? What is or what am I going to do? And so that's as simple as that. But we tell them up front, like, we're interested in understanding language and how it affects people's decision making. So people have reported in previous studies that they use third person when they are deliberating or making decisions. And so we tell them like what we want them to do, we explain to them, and then we show them in practice what it looks like. So we have some sentences that say, I am going to get chocolate ice cream, or Walt is going to get chocolate ice cream. So something like that. So we give them a kind of explanation of what we want to do, what we want them to do and why, and then what it looks like, and then we fill in the blanks for them. So when the decision comes up, it says their name or it says I, so they read it. It's like, if I was to look at it, it'd be like, Walt is going to make this decision. It's a great question, though.
So one implication of this hypothesis, if this is going on, it implies that self-distancing actually has no effect on the content of one's moral principles. So self-distancing won't, make people more altruistic or really make them anything. If this hypothesis is right, then what self-distancing does is it just increases adherence to your own moral principle, whatever that moral principle is. There's another possibility, hypothesis 2, I'll call it. Might be that self-distancing causes individuals to act only in ways that are reasonably acceptable to all people involved. Why would we think this? So here's the rationale again. We begin in the same way. So we know that self-distancing increases psychological distance, and psychological distance promotes abstract thought. I've already said that. In the previous argument, I then jumped to say, when moral principles are abstract, so therefore self-distancing will cause somebody to regulate their conduct by their moral principles. But I'd like now to think a bit more about what this abstract thought is. What is it for distance to promote abstract thought? What are we talking about? Trope and Lieberman, who work on this quite a bit, they write that abstraction, the sort of abstraction that is triggered by psychological distance, promotes attunement to properties that remain constant across multiple contexts. So psychological distance or self-distancing will lead you to represent a situation or object or event using an abstract high-level construal, and it'll promote attunement. It'll focus you on the central features of the object or situation or event and kind of ignore the peripheral unnecessary features that vary with the context. I think they use one example that I think helps make this clear. It's a non-moral, non-social example. So if I am looking at an object, a chair or something, there's a chair way at the far end of the room. That chair over there looks quite small. But of course, if I walk towards the chair, it's going to get bigger and bigger. It's going to appear to be bigger and bigger. Its retinal size will increase, I guess. But I don't think that the chair is growing, of course. I know it's just a chair that's staying the same size, and I'm just getting closer to it. How do I do this? Well, Trope and Lieberman write that identifying an object in near and distant locations as being the same requires forming an abstract concept. For example, a chair that omits incidental features like its retinal size and retains essential, relatively invariant features like its overall shape and proportions. So this is the sort of abstract concept. This is the abstract thought that's promoted by psychological distance. If I'm representing a chair abstractly, well, that abstract representation is going to promote attunement to the chair's properties that are invariant with respect to my position relative to it. So the concept of the chair that I'm using doesn't depend on how close I am or how far away I am from the chair. It seems to me like it's natural to move from this to the self-distancing context. What would this tell me about what happens when I self-distance? Well, then I'll form an abstract representation of my own situation. Following the same pattern, that means that my abstract representation of my own situation will promote attunement to my situation's properties that are invariant with respect to my position in it. So in other words, for the dictator game scenario, when I self-distance and I represent my own circumstances, I'll use a construal of them that describes my situation. I'm sorry, if I'm immersed. If I'm immersed, I will describe my situation as one in which I have $10. And I can either keep the $10, or I can give 5 of it away, or I can give all of it away, or whatever. If I self-distance, I'll use an abstract, high-level construal, and I'll represent my circumstances differently in a way that doesn't depend on my position in the situation. I'll say, well, one person has $10, and that person can give it to some other person. The idea here is that if I think from a self-distanced perspective, I'm not going to focus on what is good for me or what is acceptable to me, but I'll be forced to kind of consider all points of view because I don't actually appear in any particular place in this abstract construal because the abstract construal is invariant with respect to my position in it. That's what makes it abstract. So I'm forced to think in this more general way, so that'll lead me to ask questions about what actions are reasonably acceptable to all people involved. So we have 2 possibilities. Hypothesis 1, self-distancing is just going to make me adhere to my own moral principles, whatever they are. So this says that self-distancing is actually kind of morally neutral or value neutral. And hypothesis 2, which says self-distancing causes individuals to act in ways that are reasonably acceptable to all. Now, in the dictator game scenario, in the basic, simple dictator game scenario, these are going to come out to the same thing. They'll have the same predictions, I think, just because in the dictator game, it's a zero-sum game. There are no gains to be had from donating the money. Nobody has any prior claim or any special claim to the money. It's, just a choice. Give the money away, keep it yourself. It seems like anything that the dictator does will be reasonably acceptable to all. So that part of hypothesis 2 is not going to add any additional constraints. So hypothesis 2 and hypothesis 1 are going to have the same predictions in this particular context. So both of these hypotheses are consistent with our initial results. So which, if either of them, actually is doing the work? Well, I'm going to turn it back to Walt, and he'll tell you how we're going to.
So that was our challenge to try to figure out a way that we could disentangle what's going on via those 2 hypotheses. So we added a second study. We're calling it 1B, where we're going to look at the dictator game with adding a variable, priming social goals. So the method is the same setup with the dictator game, except right after they get their money. And as you notice, it's not a confederate anymore. We're going to bring 2 participants in and play them off one another. They believe that they're both have equal chance to be either the decider or the recipient, but then when you actually make the decision, they'll be separated and they both will be put into the decider role. So we're going to we're already using experimental games, so might as well go all the way as a social psychologist and introduce again another controversial method, and that is social priming. So we're going to try to prime goals. They go into one of 2 different conditions, either the pro-social goals or the anti-social goals. And this is a method that's been used in other experimental paradigms. So we give them sentences that they have to unscramble. And when they unscramble these sentences, they see that if they're in the pro-social condition, that as they unscramble the sentences, they're being primed with pro-sociality. So they see sentences like, I share sweets, or I help my coworkers. And then if they're in the antisocial condition, as they unscramble these sentences, they will be primed with antisocial tendencies or antisocial behavior, like I stole sweets, or I make my coworkers do all the hard work. And so there's 16 of these sentences. It takes a bit of time because they have to unscramble them, but it gets their brain working, gets their mind working, and at the end of it, they are primed with either a pro-social or antisocial goal. And then they're put into the self-distancing paradigm, conditions. So it's a 2x2, and then they have to make the same decision. And we extrapolated this method, the pro-social or antisocial priming, from a series of studies done by Hamilton. The asterisk here, you can't see it, the footnote there, but we're also going to include a control where there's no priming, because along with priming social values or social goals, we're also going to measure social value orientation as an individual difference. And this is a measure that Murphy and colleagues have developed based on the long history of social dilemmas and how people have enduring tendencies to be either pro-social or selfish or anywhere they fall on the circumplex here, based on a series of 6 questions on how they allocate units between themselves and another random stranger. And so they fill out this questionnaire, they pop out through an algorithm on this circumplex, and that should be predictive of some behavior. So we're going to also look at prosociality or social value orientation as an individual difference measure. So here's the first prediction that we find based on what Warren described via the theorizing. So if this first prediction is correct, that social distancing just taps into a priori values that are value neutral, then we would see an effect like this, where if you're in the pro-social condition, as you distance, you will be inclined to give more. So that's why you see the red bar at about 5 points, a little over 5. But however, if you're in an antisocial condition, you've been primed with antisocial values, then you will be more inclined to keep more money for yourself. And so we have this prediction as a full interaction between the 2 variables. And there's the power analysis below. As you can see, with an interaction and now the updated effect size, that's quite a few participants that we're going to recruit for this study. Prediction 2, under what Warren has called, can I use it, universalizable. This ideal that when you distance, you take the perspective of the one or everyone simultaneously, and that your behavior is regulated in that way. And so as you see, then we don't predict a full interaction, but we predict that in the antisocial condition, self-distancing will moderate that tendency or alleviate it, and you will be more pro-social. So these are 2 competing hypotheses, and I'm not going to disclose what side I'm on. I'm definitely not on one or the other, so I'll tell you who the other 2 are in conflict. But it's interesting that these 2 hypotheses have been generated to explain the previous results, because it does start to, based on what we find here, it'll start to connect some of the previous results we've had in other research around self-distancing in the lab, like when we studied it in conjunction with unethical behavior or wise reasoning or emotional reactivity. So I'm looking very forward to see how this study turns out, to see how we go forward. So speaking of going forward, so after we finish this study, we're going to run a paradigm unlike the Dictator Game, where it's not a unilateral decision by the decider, it's now an interdependent decision. And so we're going to use the public goods paradigm. And with this, you have 4 participants that come into the lab. They all are ostensibly think that they're all going to make the same decision, so there's no deception at all. They're all told they're going to get $10, and they're going to have to make a decision on how they split this $10 to the communal pot, or they keep for themselves. Each person will be self-distanced or immersed, and then they will have to make a decision on how they're going to divvy up this $10. And so the trick here is that they also know that whatever they give to the pot and whatever their colleagues give to the pot, it will be doubled and then divided by 4 and then sent back to each individual. So the rational, or Warren hates that term, but the optimal decision in this context would be that you keep everything and you hope that everybody else gives all their money to the pot. And then you walk away with $25. The worst thing that could happen is that you give all your money, everybody else keeps it, and then you leave with only $5. So there is definitely a wide range of variance here, and so we think that is going to get these participants thinking differently than they did with the Dictator Game, because the Dictator Game, it was a unilateral decision, and there's a strong sense or strong norm of fairness that's in that paradigm, where here it's a little more complicated. There's other competing motives that could be helping prompting the participants to behave the way they do. So we predict that in the public goods game that we'll see the effect we originally proposed, or the effect that we originally hypothesized, that people in the distancing condition will give more. will give more to the pot because of the different condition, the different environment that they're in, and that it's more social versus this independent, unilateral decision. And there's the power analysis. We've updated the effect size based on what we saw in the first experiment. And then the third study is a helping task. Same situation, participant comes in the lab, they're told to do a job, they're going to get paid for the job they do based on how fast they do it and how many widgets or how many things they do on the computer. And then they're put into the immerse or distance condition. And then while they're working on the computer, Confederate RA is going to come in the lab and drop a bunch of staplers or stuff, just office supplies, right next to the computer that they're working at. And they will have to make a decision either to stop what they're doing and not maximize their output and help the Confederate, or continue to work. And we're going to measure if they do it or not, and then how long it takes them to react. And so this prediction is the same. We do predict that because of the social norms involved in this situation, that they will follow the original hypothesis. So based on these 3 experiments that we are going to continue to do, we feel like we'll have a good enough answer as what hypothesis that we can lean upon, and then that will feed into the final study we're going to do, and that's the experiential sampling study, where it's already been described at length. I'm just going to point out some of the differences here. So we're going to put them through a self-distancing training or in a self-immersion training, and we're also going to have a no treatment control because we're going to measure spontaneous self-distancing. So this is a procedure that we've used in the lab where, somewhat like an individual difference, we can measure how likely someone is to self-distance during reflection or decision-making. And then we'll follow the standard experiential sampling paradigm. For 2 weeks, we'll contact them 5 times a day and ask them a series of questions to see how they cooperate or how they show compassion to other people in their everyday lives. And we believe that this will show us how self-distancing influences pro-social behavior outside of the lab. But with the 2 studies together, the laboratory and the experiential sampling study, we believe that we'll have some evidence to either support hypothesis 1, hypothesis 2, and then continue the research from there. I do want to point out that self-distancing of the last couple of weeks has become quite popular in the media. 2 weeks ago here, or very recently, there was an article about how can you achieve mindfulness, which is very popular quickly. And this is a quote from the article that this gentleman wrote saying, if you can self-distance with these simple manipulations, get some of the same benefits that you would from mindfulness training. And then David Brooks 2 days ago, or a couple of days ago, he had a opinion page about choice and how choice is it's complicated in that we have egocentric perspectives that get in the way. And if we can learn how to self-distance well and develop these techniques and how we can remove the experiencing self from the reasoning self, then we can counteract some of the flaws in our mental machinery.
The first of these 2 articles actually really excited to see. I've never seen that before, but they noticed the connection too.
Thank you. On behalf of Ethan and Warren, this conference has been great. I appreciate all the talks and the camaraderie, and I'm blessed to be here with everyone. Thank you.
Very intriguing set of studies, and I like the progression that you're taking. I'm wondering about how it might link up to this idea of the essential moral self. So if you strongly identify with your sort of moral code, and then you're distancing yourself from that, might that lead you to feel more comfortable making a decision that might be less pro-social? Right, so why would self-distancing necessarily be great if you're already strongly identified with your code?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I would think that when you don't self-distance, so certainly you identify with the code, you think that that's who you are, but that doesn't mean that that moral principle will most effectively motivate you to act in a certain way in a situation. It seems to me like the circumstances can be such that you're distracted by this, or you're distracted by that, or you're just overwhelmed by your own self-interest. So that abstract moral principle kind of takes a back seat. Although if asked, yeah, sure, you identify with that.
And just a
principle.
very brief follow-up, like might there be a dark side to self-distancing if you're placed in a situation where you're asked or you're expected by, like you're a prison guard or something to do something that might not be moral?
So that's the big difference between hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2 in terms of the practical implications. If hypothesis 1 tells the story, then yeah, there's a potential dark side to self-distancing. Because this is a tool that we can use to make people more efficient followers of rules. I tell you to do this, and I realize that you're not going to follow my instructions, so therefore I just get you to self-distance, and now you're going to do it, or something like that. So yeah, I can get you to do horrible things. Now, if hypothesis 2 is correct, then self-distancing plays this regulatory role, that it will block certain motives or drives or principles or something. And if I instruct you to do something that is morally reprehensible in the sense that it's not reasonably acceptable to all involved, well, then that sort of motive will be blocked by the self-distancing process. So depending on whether hypothesis 1 or hypothesis 2 is correct, the answer is either yes, there's a dark side, or no, actually, it's a better story because self-distancing prevents that sort of dark thing from happening.
Thanks for that interesting talk. I love when experiments don't go the way they're expected to. Dawn actually had a question about the conceptual foundation, and I'm not like a Smith expert, which you no doubt are, Warren, but my knowledge of Smith comes from The Wealth of Nations, where selfishness is seen as being actually in the interest of the whole collectivity. And I wondered if, what it is conceptually that Smith gives you to help with these questions that's distinct from Cooley or Mead or somebody more recent talking about that kind of self-distancing, but without the sort of mercantile background, maybe?
So I don't know about those others, so I can't tell you what's distinctive about Smith versus them, unfortunately. So I mean, what Smith gave me, to be honest, was just this initial idea, this idea of distancing oneself from oneself and taking on this third-person perspective that's, reasonably informed about the circumstances that you're in, but otherwise just not involved. And that's really that's all the impartial spectator is for Smith. It's just this person who's watching you and knows the situation, but is neither directly nor indirectly involved in your circumstances, and that's kind of it. And I just took that idea and then met Walt and Ethan, and we started kind of running with it. But that's the basic idea. There's more to it, but that's the basic idea that got us going.
So this is great stuff. I really like it. There are different degrees of self-distancing, though, I think. And when Smith talks about the impartial spectator, it seems like he's zooming way the hell out. All you guys are doing is manipulating the pronoun or the proper name. Yep. And now, what's amazing about the work, in general, the Ethan Kross work overall, is that tiny manipulation gets effects. Yep. But you might get much larger effects from zooming out further. Yes. And so the thing is, if you zoom out a little bit and you see, oh, there are two people there. Well, I'm looking at me and the other person. Or you zoom out further and you say, there are two people in that room, but then there are all these other rooms. You can get more and more impartial as you step away. And I wonder whether you've thought about looking at those kinds of things.
Yeah, I have. And Ethan and I have talked about it. And I agree with you. I think if we can develop techniques that what I call shrink the self smaller and smaller, we'll see different effects of magnitude and probably in just degree and difference. And so I completely share the intuition that you have, but this is as far as we've gotten so far. But yeah, that's the plan going forward.
And we've talked about that, and that was a concern that, it's probably a mistake to think of either self-distanced or not, but it probably is a continuum. And we've discussed other linguistic or non-linguistic manipulations to try to increase that distance, but it's just not something we've done yet.
We are a little constrained, because in these type of lab scenarios, so when Ethan has done these experiments with rumination and how to think about your memories in a more adaptive way. He's been able to take different techniques, like he uses a visualization technique that he asks people to think about themselves like they're a fly on the wall and they're watching the situation unfold as they recall a specific memory. However, the work that I've done with Ethan, it's hard because we're looking at like live online decision making, and to get people to think like that while they're making decisions, it's kind of corny, to be quite honest with you. And so this is the only one that we've been able to kind of streamline into online decision making. And so we're thinking about different ways we can do that, but it's difficult.
If anyone has any suggestions, by
Yeah.
all means, let us know.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah,
Peggy? And then Owen?
I agree with Sean about the distancing. To me, thanks for the thought-provoking presentation. So to me, the self-distancing is very similar to reflection, but it's more either self-involved or self-distanced, right? Is that correct? So, and also it really promotes the metacognition, but they are doing the dictator game, right? So they are playing against dictator. Is that correct? Am I correct? That's
Well,
what I've been
in
thinking.
the dictator game, you're told that there's another participant and that you have all the authority and there's no recourse. You're never going to interact with this person again. And
Right.
so, yes, there's another person, but psychologically speaking, you have all the power.
Right. Okay. So you are actually dictator. Okay.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
that was actually my mistake. I'm sorry, because I thought I was playing against dictator, but actually that's not the case. I
No.
am the dictator.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Gotcha. Okay. Then yeah, I think that I agree with that when you are actually promoting metacognition, and I think you are promoting a lot with promoting the strategies a lot, how to win this game too. So I don't know if that's especially in this case, they're not really try to this self-distancing, just changing the pronoun doesn't really make them to think virtuously. It's maybe just to think more. So
Yeah.
maybe that was my
Yes,
initial
yeah.
idea. Yeah.
Yeah, the mechanism is, it's interesting. So just by thinking in the third person, I think the two hypotheses kind of illustrate that it could be that it's just giving you a different perspective and maybe allowing you to see your goals more clearly, or their goals are more salient, however you want to describe it. And whatever those goals are, like Warren said, they're value neutral. If you're coming to the situation with a certain set of goals, but the situation calls for, based on the norms of the situation, for you to act in a different way. So for like the dictator game, you may come into the situation wanting to make money because you're an undergraduate student. You're going to get paid $10 for this experiment that you're doing. So you walk in with this value or this goal, and then the norms of the game that Kahneman and all the experimental economists have shown is that the homo economist, you're supposed to keep all that money. There's no reason why you should give that money at all. But everybody splits it. And so there's this norm of fairness. And so when you come into that experimental paradigm or the situation, when you distance, you're kind of seeing through the milieu of that fairness intuition, and you're going back to that, I want to make money. And I think that might be what's happening.
Thank you. I wanted to mention a couple of friends of mine that I have that whenever they've done something they don't feel proud of, they refer to themselves in an alternate name. So I have a friend, Tracy, that whenever she's done something she realizes she should not have done, she becomes Barbara. And she says, well, Barbara did that. And I could easily imagine that same sort of thing with the I versus Peggy. Peggy did that.
Yeah.
Not me. So I actually would have predicted exactly what you got.
Well, what'd she do? So she created distance from herself, right? That's all she's trying to do.
Right, but she uses it as an excuse for doing something less moral than she would like
right.
to think she is. So the more you distance yourself, the more you don't you claim to disidentify with the evil thing or the immoral thing you did. So that's how I would have viewed exactly what happened here, not anything tied to what you're saying. It's just that I don't have to identify with what I did. I don't have to be moral.
Yeah.
Peggy did that. Or more likely, Barbara did that. I mean, so what you're not identifying with an immoral act anymore.
Yep.
That would be my take on it.
Well, and this is why we're doing that second experiment, because maybe through either the priming or the individual difference, we can start to see some a moderation.
Great. Thanks again for a very provocative talk. So I would have thought that the natural hypothesis, I think, would be a third one, which is just would go like this: that especially in a college student population, when we are asked to abstract, to do the self-distancing, that we know sort of characteristically, I can go to two different sort of two different perspectives. One is the moral perspective, and the other is a prudential perspective. Now, you mentioned that you have this bimodal distribution, right?
Yeah.
So it would just seem that would be the easiest way to answer it, that when people move abstractly, some people are going to, what ought I to do from the moral point of view? And those people are going to do what actually many people do already, but they're going to do it reflectively, right? Give 5. And other people are going to think, I think as Walt was indicating he thinks, what a rational economic agent ought to do. And that would get you your bimodal distribution. So I'm not sure that that's, as I understand the two hypotheses, that's not there.
It seems to me like that's a variant of the first one.
Okay, that's what you thought. I wondered if you thought.
Yeah. So the first one, just says they'll regulate their behavior by whatever principle they already endorse. Now, they could be aware that there are these two options. I mean, that's like the
I guess
Henry
I
Sidgwick
would.
thing, right?
The reason I thought it wouldn't be a variant of the first one is that these they wouldn't need to be what they're endorsing. It would be like doing a problem in calculus. You don't have to. You're just taking a calculus exam, and you're asked to do it, and you need to move into calculus mode to do it properly.
But presumably, I mean, they're saying, okay, there are these two ways: the self-interested way or the, point of view of the universe way.
Right.
I'm going to do the self-interested way. I mean, so they're
right. The only question then would be whether they think the demand characteristics of what you're requesting are such that they're supposed to be reflecting on taking some impartial point of view, of which there are at least those two, which by the time you're in college, you know a lot about both of them as options. That was my thought.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
So I also think, I don't think what I'm going to say fits into either hypothesis, so I think it's a third hypothesis too. And the way I'd like to set this up is, and it's very similar to what Peggy is saying, is that there's a constraint on a certain percentage of that population. And that constraint is that they sense that what they're doing somehow could get them in trouble. And they therefore, and the distancing manipulation is eliminating that constraint, so that now they feel free to engage in that activity. So they are not, so this is kind of trying to get into the phenomenology of what's happening and why are they behaving this way. So again, the proposition is there's a constraint, which basically is, I'm going to get in trouble, people are going to think I'm bad because I'm doing this. I want to do it, but I'm not going to do it because people will think I'm bad, so there's basically a social constraint.
This makes sense.
And it's going to be removed by the distancing, so that now I can do this. And there is experimental evidence to support this idea.
Yeah.
Because Larry Barsalou, there probably are others, but I know of a study done by Larry Barsalou, who's a PhD student. She's now at Harvard. She's a postdoc there on a very similar kind of idea, which they call mindful attention. But they did an immersed state, very similar paradigm, an immersed state, and then they do what they call, it's like a decentering, but there's a lot of similarity in this case between the distancing and the decentering paradigm. And in the decentering paradigm, or in this would be for you distancing, threat to self goes down.
Yep.
So you lower your threat to self, you feel less threatened. You've got something else going on, which is actually that your sense of agency is one step removed. It's not I'm doing this bad. It's not that bad, by the way. It's right at the threshold, it's just you just need a little nudge and now you do it. So it's like, if I do it, it's not so bad. If John does it, he says, I don't feel that bad. I mean, it's okay. John needs to do it, whatever. So that would be my hypothesis.
Yeah, well, even our own data supports that. So previous experiment we did, we wanted to see if self-distancing would alleviate parochial norms, so in a loyalty dilemma. So this is a study I did for my end of my dissertation. So we had participants think about, they just witnessed a relationship they have, so it could be a close relationship or a casual relationship or even a very distant relationship, steal something to varying degrees. And then they were approached by some authority figure, let's say a police officer, and they were asked, what do you know about this? And in the immersed condition, it's what you'd expect. The higher the severity, the less likely are to rat out on their relationship. And then that interacts with how close the relationship is. So the closer you are, the more loyal you're going to be. But when we had participants distance, that I guess they were freed up, or they were allowed to rat on their relationship now when the saliency was high with a high severity act. And so it matches what you're saying. But you can see where we made this prediction, because when you're in that type of dilemma, when you have to choose between doing the honest thing or the loyal thing, what's moral? That's the question. And so this is what led us to the original hypothesis. But now that we see the results we see here, now it's starting to shed light on these other results that we've had in the lab. So it's really interesting what we're seeing here. And I tend to now agree with what all you've said, that distancing is creating this disconnectedness, or whatever you want to talk, from your moral self, I think.
It removes some kind of constraint.
Yeah.
But how do you reconcile that with all the other self-distancing? I stated that earlier when I looked up
Yeah.
what the literature that you cited to begin with.
Well, here's how so Ethan studied distancing in the context of, like, you have a bad memory or you feel bad about a breakup. And so the effects for distancing work in that context. Here comes Walt, and he wants to study morality. And so I know some people make the argument that moral decision-making is just another extension of just decision-making in general. But then I and others will argue that moral decision-making has there's something different about it, right? And so I think this interaction between self-distancing and morality is why we're seeing these interesting results.
Did those other studies use the same method, from moving from I to
So
the
Ethan has
third
used
person?
a couple
Same?
different methodologies. One is the distancing through visualization. So take a perspective of a fly on the wall. And then he's also more recently developed this linguistic manipulation. And this is the only one I've used because, like I said before, I can't figure out how to do the other one in these decision-making contexts when you're online without it being really artificial.
The other thing that came to mind, sorry, prerogative here, was that when you see your own name there's an affection there, there's familiarity, and that might push you into, oh yeah, Walt's a good guy,
Yep.
kind of this, so that.
So we've had this discussion.
That was
We've had this is a
no,
big
that was
discussion.
my worry.
Yeah.
It was, I thought that by the use of your own name, you might be triggering an endowment effect, or like you say, some affection for that person, and something along those lines. So I'm concerned about that aspect of the manipulation, to be honest. And we've been discussing using other third-person manipulations.
To check the manipulation,
Yeah.
like mom or dad or something.
We're just digging that integration deeper and deeper.
Yep.
And
That's
deeper.
Go ahead, Michelle.
I just had a question, which is that, so now you've got first person and third person as your manipulation, but have you thought about the second person?
Yep.
You know, like I'm thinking about the Gestalt,
Yep.
empty chair sort of thing. Like it seems to me that might actually make much more of a connection between, say.
So there is research that Ethan's doing in the lab with other grad students right now with that exact same question. So I don't know what they're finding, but I have some intuitions. And even in an earlier pilot study I did earlier in my graduate school career, I just separated first person and an other than first person. So I allowed them to use second person, third person pronouns like we, and then also their name. And you did see some variance. So your intuition is right on.
So I just wanted to note that Boaz Kesar and Albert Costa have been doing some work on second language use as a kind of distancing mechanism, and it makes people more consequentialist. And some work that we've done on social licensing using John List's manipulation of the take $1 instead of just give $5, and that reduces the number of people who give. And undergraduates tend to doubt the plausibility of a Confederate in the dictator task, actually. So
well, we ask them that in a funnel debriefing, and that it is annotated if they do think that there's something fishy going on.
And lastly, Howard wanted to make a pedagogical point that if you're referring to the size constancy issue, the size constancy refers to the fact that actually the chair doesn't look like it changes size in spite of the retinal image changing. That's the first point. Trope's explanation is wrong. So it turns out that you can make a chair, in spite of knowing it's a chair, look very big or look very small depending on context. So just like color and brightness constancy, it's actually not about retinal properties or abstract knowledge, but it's about context difference.
Yeah. Very good point. Thank you.
That's cool. In response to Peggy's and John's comments, and I think that makes a lot of sense that distance could give you a license to rationalize any kind of selfish behavior. But I'm not sure that I would frame it as necessarily as a freeing of an inherent pervasive motive for selfish behavior. That in other words, it's not, I wouldn't buy into the idea that just because the person is close, they really want to be selfish, but they're just kind of putting the brakes on it because it wouldn't be cool to do it, it wouldn't be acceptable. I think there might be a direct affiliative response that comes from proximity that has nothing to do with restraint, but would be genuinely what the person is instinctively would do.
That's your reward for being such a good guy. Go ahead. You go first twice, and then I'll go first. I'll go second once. That works. All right, you trump me.
So what happens when you use
Actually,
that word?
just confused me, so I'll go first just to get it over with. I guess the thing what I'm hearing from the audience and what your data seem to say to me is to really raise questions about the initial assumption that self-distancing is a virtue at all.
Yep.
So the way I would reframe it is thinking about what sort of self-distancing might be a virtue, when and in what ways could we induce that, as opposed to simply self-observation, which could be for good or ill,
Yep,
right?
totally agree.
And one way to think about that, of course, is self-conscious people do a lot of self-distancing, and it's not very good for them, and it's not very good for anybody else, typically. So, so I think that would be a way to rethink where you're going, is to try to think about, well, what kind of self-distancing would be good? What kind of would lead to good behavior?
Yes, sir. Yep. Totally agree. Thank you.
Okay, I find whenever I try to imagine, I have so much trouble with these economic games as measures of virtue, because whenever I try to imagine what I would do in these situations, I just get paralyzed. Sort of the way I think Michael was talking about it, with your talk. I get lost. What if I had $10? But of course I would just give $5. But wait a minute, why would I do that?
Why, yeah.
Maybe I should give 10. I mean, if I win a game, if I'm playing a board game with someone and I win it, I don't like give them half of my victory points and be like, oh, we tied. I mean, that would be silly.
Yeah.
I mean, I start getting confused about what's the fair thing to do in this situation. I really get lost. And like you were talking about, the optimal or rational or whatever outcome. And it seems to me, which if you had to choose the two options, which one would you rather have done? Would you rather be the person who kept all the money to yourself and everybody else gave it all to the common pool, and then you ended up like this $25 and you like really scammed everybody? Would you rather be that person, or would you rather be the person who donated it all and then no one else did, and you ended up only getting $2.5?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be the optimal outcome? So
Yeah, that's a great
maybe.
question. I mean, but so the economists would say that the optimal outcome is how much money you walk away at the end of the day, right? And so.
Right, but that's not what we're not even interested in that, right? This is a study of virtue. So.
Talking about utility, right? Like you might feel better having lost than having stolen everybody else's money.
Yeah, but isn't sharing virtuous? Isn't like if I have $10 and we both entered into the game, and it just by chance I got to be the decider and you got to be receiver. Isn't the fair thing to do? And could you argue that fairness is a virtue? Isn't the fair thing to do is to split that money?
I have to say I can't tell.
Just saying. But he asked a kind of semi-rhetorical question, so I'm asking it back. I mean,
Yeah, I have to say I get paralyzed with that. I think of the things like the way Michael was talking about it a while back. It's like I start thinking, well, wait a minute, is that the right thing or what? And maybe that's true. So then it all goes back to that third hypothesis that I was sort of expecting, that I think
Therapy will.
with the sunglasses on. I'm done.
Thank you.